The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Florence as Lorenzo walked through the marketplace, his mind churning with thoughts that had haunted him for months. Around him, merchants hawked their wares while citizens moved about their daily routines, seemingly content with their predetermined roles in society's grand theater. Yet Lorenzo saw something different in their movements, a subtle resignation, a quiet acceptance of limitations imposed not by nature or necessity, but by systems designed to keep them docile and manageable. Lorenzo had spent years studying the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, not merely as historical curiosities, but as blueprints for understanding the mechanics of power. What struck him most profoundly was not Machiavelli's supposed cynicism, but his unflinching realism about human nature and the structures that govern societies. The Florentine philosopher had written extensively about princes and principalities, but embedded within those treatises lay deeper truths about personal sovereignty and the courage required to claim one's rightful place in the world. As Lorenzo observed the merchants negotiating with practiced deference to established hierarchies, he reflected on Machiavelli's central insight, that most people willingly surrender their agency to those who project confidence and authority. The blacksmith who charged less than his work was worth because he feared offending wealthy patrons. The baker who accepted unreasonable demands from suppliers because challenging them seemed too risky. The scribe who worked endless hours for meager pay because he believed his circumstances were unchangeable. These were not victims of external oppression, Lorenzo realized, but participants in their own subjugation. They had internalized the very chains that bound them, wearing their limitations like comfortable clothing they had grown afraid to remove. Machiavelli had understood this dynamic centuries earlier when he wrote about the difficulty of liberating people who have become accustomed to servitude. The challenge was not merely political but psychological. People had to be awakened to their own power before they could learn to wield it effectively. Lorenzo's contemplation was interrupted by a commotion near the fountain at the center of the square. A young merchant named Marco was arguing with a tax collector who had demanded payment far exceeding what was legally owed. The crowd that gathered seemed sympathetic to Marco's plight, but no one intervened. They watched with the passive curiosity of spectators at a theatrical performance, as if the outcome were predetermined and resistance futile. This scene crystallized for Lorenzo the essence of Machiavelli's teachings about the nature of power. The tax collector possessed no inherent authority beyond what others were willing to grant him. His power existed only because people believed in it and chose not to challenge it. Marco, despite having justice on his side, was losing the confrontation not because he lacked right or reason, but because he approached the situation from a position of assumed weakness. Watching this unfold, Lorenzo remembered Machiavelli's observation that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, meaning they are more influenced by appearances than by actual substance. The tax collector's confident demeanor and official-looking documents carried more weight than Marco's legitimate grievances because the crowd expected authority to prevail over justice. This expectation became a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating the very reality it anticipated. The first part of understanding Machiavellian liberation, Lorenzo understood, lay in recognizing these psychological dynamics. Most people live their lives reacting to circumstances rather than creating them. They waited for permission that would never come, sought approval from those who had no genuine authority to grant it, and accepted limitations that existed primarily in their own minds. They had been conditioned to believe that challenging established orders was dangerous, unwise, or simply impossible. This conditioning served the interests of those who benefited from maintaining existing power structures. By keeping people focused on their limitations rather than their possibilities, by encouraging them to seek security through submission rather than strength through self-reliance, the established order perpetuated itself without requiring overt coercion. The most effective chains, Lorenzo realized, were those that people forged for themselves and wore willingly. Machiavelli had written extensively about the qualities necessary for effective leadership, but Lorenzo understood that these same qualities applied to anyone seeking to break free from imposed limitations. The first requirement was what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but the combination of strength, skill, and adaptability that enabled effective action in an uncertain world. This meant developing the confidence to trust one's own judgment, even when it contradicted conventional wisdom or popular opinion. The second requirement was a clear-eyed assessment of reality rather than wishful thinking or comfortable illusions. Machiavelli insisted that effective action required understanding the world as it actually was, not as one wished it to be. This meant recognizing that most people were motivated primarily by self-interest, that loyalty was conditional and temporary, and that good intentions without adequate power to implement them were worthless. The third requirement was the willingness to act decisively when opportunities presented themselves. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of fortune and timing, noting that even the best-laid plans could fail if executed at the wrong moment. However, he also emphasized that fortune favored those who were prepared to seize opportunities when they arose. Hesitation and excessive deliberation were often more dangerous than bold action, even when that action carried significant risks. As Lorenzo walked home through the darkening streets, he considered how these principles might apply to Marco's situation with the tax collector. Marco had approached the confrontation defensively, seeking to prove his innocence rather than establishing his strength. He had appealed to fairness and justice, assuming these concepts carried inherent power, when in fact they only mattered if backed by the ability and willingness to enforce them. A Machiavellian approach would have been fundamentally different. Rather than defending himself, Marco might have gone on the offensive, questioning the tax collector's authority and demanding documentation of his claims. Instead of appealing to abstract principles, he could have made the confrontation costly for the tax collector by drawing attention to irregularities in the collection process. Rather than standing alone, he might have organized other merchants facing similar demands, creating a coalition that could challenge the system collectively. The key insight was that power dynamics were fluid and constantly negotiated through every interaction. By accepting the role of supplicant seeking mercy, Marco had reinforced the very hierarchy that oppressed him. By projecting confidence and refusing to accept predetermined roles, he could have shifted the dynamic entirely. The tax collector's authority existed only through the consent of those who chose to recognize it. Withdraw that consent, and the authority disappeared. This realization led Lorenzo to deeper reflections on the nature of personal sovereignty. Most people, he observed, lived their lives seeking external validation and permission. They wanted to be liked, respected, and approved of by others, and this desire made them vulnerable to manipulation and control. They modified their behavior to meet others' expectations, compromised their values to avoid conflict, and sacrificed their goals to maintain relationships that often served others' interests more than their own. Machiavelli had understood that this tendency made most people unsuitable for leadership or independent action. They were too concerned with how their actions would be perceived and too dependent on others' opinions to make difficult but necessary decisions. They preferred the security of conformity to the uncertainty of charting their own course, even when that conformity led to frustration and unfulfillment. Breaking free from these patterns required what Machiavelli called the lion and the fox, the combination of strength and cunning that enabled effective action in a complex world. The lion represented the willingness to use force when necessary, to stand one's ground against opposition, and to project the kind of confidence that commanded respect. The fox represented the intelligence to navigate complex situations, to understand others' motivations and weaknesses, and to achieve one's goals through strategy rather than brute force alone. Most importantly, this transformation required accepting responsibility for one's own circumstances rather than blaming external factors for personal limitations. Machiavelli had little patience for those who complained about their situations while refusing to take action to change them. He understood that the world was inherently unfair and that waiting for justice or fairness to prevail naturally was a recipe for perpetual disappointment. The next morning brought news that would test Lorenzo's understanding of these principles in the most direct way possible. Marco, the merchant from the previous day's confrontation, had been arrested on charges of tax evasion and disturbing the peace. The message was clear to anyone paying attention: challenge the system and face the consequences. The tax collector had moved swiftly to make an example of someone who had dared to question his authority, ensuring that other merchants would think twice before following Marco's lead. Lorenzo felt the familiar tug of conventional thinking urging him to express sympathy for Marco while maintaining a safe distance from his troubles. The sensible approach would be to view this as confirmation that resistance was futile and that accommodation was the wisest course. After all, Marco's family now faced financial ruin, and his reputation in the merchant community was destroyed. Surely this proved that challenging authority was not only dangerous but counterproductive. Yet as Lorenzo reflected more deeply on the situation, he began to see it through a different lens. Machiavelli had written extensively about the necessity of understanding one's enemies and their methods. The swift retaliation against Marco was not a sign of strength but of weakness. It revealed that the tax collection system was vulnerable to challenge and required harsh responses to maintain its facade of legitimacy. If the system were truly secure, Marco's protest would have been ignored or dismissed rather than met with such forceful punishment. This insight opened up new possibilities for action. The very harshness of the response suggested that organized resistance could be effective if properly planned and executed. The key was to learn from Marco's mistakes while building on his courage. He had been right to challenge the system but wrong in his approach. He had acted alone, without preparation, and in a way that made him an easy target for retaliation. Lorenzo began to formulate a different approach, one that reflected Machiavelli's teachings about effective action. Rather than confronting the system directly, he would begin by building networks of support among those who shared similar concerns. Rather than making himself a target through public protests, he would work behind the scenes to document irregularities and build cases that could withstand official scrutiny. Rather than appealing to abstract principles of justice, he would make resistance a matter of practical self-interest for those who had the power to make meaningful changes. The first step was to understand the personal motivations and weaknesses of those who maintained the current system. Machiavelli had emphasized that effective action required deep knowledge of human nature and the specific circumstances that drove individual behavior. The tax collector, for instance, was not an abstract embodiment of authority but a particular person with specific needs, fears, and vulnerabilities. Through discreet inquiries, Lorenzo learned that the tax collector, Giuseppe, was deeply in debt due to his gambling habits and had been skimming from collected taxes to cover his losses. His aggressive collection tactics were driven not by devotion to duty but by desperation to cover his embezzlement before it was discovered. This knowledge transformed the entire dynamic. Giuseppe was not a powerful official backed by the full authority of the state, but a vulnerable criminal one investigation away from disgrace and imprisonment. Armed with this understanding, Lorenzo began to see how Machiavellian principles could be applied to create change. Rather than attacking Giuseppe directly, he could make strategic use of information to shift the balance of power. Rather than seeking to destroy him, he could offer alternatives that served both their interests. The goal was not revenge but the establishment of more favorable conditions for legitimate merchants to operate. Lorenzo's next step was to build alliances among those who had been affected by Giuseppe's excessive demands. He approached this task with careful attention to Machiavelli's insights about human nature and motivation. He did not appeal to abstract principles of justice or fairness, knowing that these concepts carried little weight when people's immediate interests were at stake. Instead, he focused on practical benefits and concrete solutions to specific problems. To the baker who had been overcharged, he offered information about legal protections and proper procedures for challenging excessive demands. To the blacksmith who had been threatened with closure, he provided contacts with other officials who could verify proper compliance with regulations. To the textile merchant who had been forced to pay bribes, he suggested strategies for documenting demands and building cases for official review. Each of these approaches was carefully calibrated to individual circumstances and personalities. Lorenzo understood that different people required different incentives and that effective coalition building required appealing to diverse motivations rather than assuming everyone shared identical concerns. Some merchants were motivated primarily by financial considerations, others by concerns about fairness and legality, and still others by desire for revenge against someone who had humiliated them. The beauty of this approach was that it created multiple paths to the same destination while minimizing individual risk. No single person had to take the dangerous step of directly challenging Giuseppe's authority. Instead, each could take smaller, safer actions that collectively created pressure for change. The blacksmith could file proper documentation with regulatory authorities. The baker could insist on written receipts for all payments. The textile merchant could request official reviews of collection procedures. Individually, these actions might be dismissed or ignored. Collectively, they created a pattern of scrutiny that made Giuseppe's embezzlement increasingly difficult to conceal. More importantly, they shifted the dynamic from individual supplication to collective assertion of rights. Giuseppe found himself responding to challenges rather than initiating them, defending his actions rather than projecting unchallenged authority. This transformation illustrated another key Machiavellian principle, the importance of changing the terms of engagement rather than simply fighting harder within existing frameworks. Marco had failed because he accepted the basic structure of the confrontation, one individual challenging an official within a system designed to favor authority over justice. Lorenzo's approach bypassed this framework entirely by creating new conditions that favored transparency and accountability over arbitrary power. The psychological impact of this shift was as important as its practical effects. As merchants began to see that Giuseppe's authority was not absolute and that his demands could be questioned through proper channels, their fundamental relationship to power began to change. They stopped seeing themselves as helpless victims of an unchangeable system and started understanding themselves as participants in a dynamic that they could influence through strategic action. This transformation extended beyond the immediate situation with Giuseppe to broader questions about personal agency and self-determination. Merchants who had previously accepted unreasonable demands from suppliers began to negotiate more aggressively. Artisans who had undervalued their work started charging prices that reflected their true worth. Families who had tolerated exploitation from landlords began to assert their rights as tenants. The changes were subtle but profound, representing a fundamental shift from reactive to proactive approaches to life's challenges. People began to see obstacles as problems to be solved rather than burdens to be endured. They started evaluating relationships and commitments based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided obligation. They developed confidence in their ability to influence outcomes rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances presented themselves. Lorenzo observed these changes with deep satisfaction, recognizing that he had facilitated something far more valuable than the resolution of a single dispute with a corrupt tax collector. He had helped people discover their own capacity for effective action and shown them that the systems they had believed to be unchangeable were actually quite fragile when subjected to sustained, intelligent pressure. Yet he also understood that these gains were fragile and could be easily reversed if people retreated into old patterns of thinking and behavior. Machiavelli had written extensively about the difficulty of maintaining reforms and the tendency for people to revert to familiar ways of operating when immediate pressures subsided. The challenge was not simply to achieve change but to make it sustainable by helping people internalize new approaches to power and authority. This realization led Lorenzo to focus on education and example rather than direct intervention. Rather than continuing to orchestrate resistance efforts, he began to teach others the principles and methods he had learned from studying Machiavelli. He shared insights about human nature and motivation, demonstrated techniques for building alliances and managing conflicts, and helped people develop the confidence and skills necessary for independent action. The goal was not to create followers who depended on his guidance, but to develop leaders who could apply Machiavellian principles to their own circumstances and challenges. Each person who mastered these approaches became a center of influence in their own right, capable of helping others break free from limiting beliefs and ineffective patterns of behavior. As autumn arrived in Florence, Lorenzo reflected on the profound changes that had taken place over the preceding months. Giuseppe had been quietly transferred to a position with less authority and opportunity for corruption, replaced by an official who operated according to established procedures and legitimate authority. More importantly, the merchant community had developed new norms of cooperation and mutual support that made future exploitation much more difficult. But these external changes, significant as they were, paled in comparison to the internal transformations Lorenzo had witnessed in individuals who had learned to apply Machiavellian principles to their personal and professional lives. These people had not simply solved specific problems, they had fundamentally altered their relationship to power and authority in ways that would serve them throughout their lives. Maria, the textile merchant, had used her experience with documentation and official procedures to expand her business into new markets previously dominated by competitors with better political connections. By understanding the bureaucratic processes that others found intimidating, she had turned regulatory compliance into a competitive advantage that opened doors previously closed to independent merchants. Antonio, the blacksmith, had applied insights about human motivation to transform his relationship with customers and suppliers. Rather than competing solely on price, he had begun offering unique combinations of quality, service, and reliability that commanded premium pricing. His success had inspired other artisans to reconsider their own approaches to business and marketing. Francesco, the baker, had used his understanding of alliance building to organize a cooperative purchasing arrangement that gave small merchants the same bulk pricing advantages previously available only to large operations. This initiative had not only improved profit margins for participants but had also demonstrated that collaborative approaches could overcome disadvantages that seemed insurmountable when faced individually. Each of these success stories illustrated key aspects of Machiavellian thinking: the importance of understanding systems rather than simply reacting to them, the value of strategic thinking over emotional responses, and the power of collective action organized around shared interests rather than abstract principles. More fundamentally, they showed how people could transform apparent weaknesses into strengths through careful analysis and creative problem solving. Lorenzo recognized that these individuals had internalized something far more valuable than specific techniques or tactics. They had developed what Machiavelli called the effectual truth about power and influence. They understood that authority was not a fixed property of certain positions or individuals but a dynamic relationship that could be influenced through skillful action. They had learned to see beyond surface appearances to underlying motivations and structural weaknesses that created opportunities for effective intervention. This understanding enabled them to approach new challenges with confidence and creativity rather than fear and resignation. When faced with obstacles, they automatically began analyzing the interests and incentives of relevant parties, looking for leverage points and potential allies, and developing strategies that could achieve their goals while minimizing risks and opposition. They had become what Machiavelli would have recognized as truly free individuals, people who shaped their circumstances rather than being shaped by them. The broader implications of these transformations extended far beyond individual success stories. As more people learned to think and act strategically, the entire social and economic environment of Florence began to shift in subtle but important ways. Arbitrary authority became more difficult to maintain as people developed skills for challenging unreasonable demands. Corruption became riskier as networks of informed citizens created accountability pressures that had not existed before. Innovation and entrepreneurship flourished as individuals gained confidence in their ability to navigate complex systems and create new opportunities. These changes did not occur through dramatic confrontations or revolutionary upheavals, but through the gradual accumulation of small shifts in daily interactions and relationships. Each person who learned to negotiate more effectively, to build alliances more skillfully, or to analyze power dynamics more accurately contributed to a broader transformation in social norms and expectations. The result was not a new system imposed from above, but an evolution of existing arrangements that better served the interests of capable and ambitious individuals. Lorenzo understood that this approach to change reflected one of Machiavelli's most profound insights, that lasting transformation came not from appeals to moral principles or dramatic gestures of resistance, but from patient work to shift the practical incentives and constraints that shaped human behavior. By helping people develop more effective approaches to pursuing their individual interests, he had created conditions that benefited the community as a whole. Yet he also recognized the limitations and potential dangers of this approach. Machiavellian principles, like any powerful tools, could be misused by those who lacked wisdom or moral grounding. The same techniques that enabled legitimate merchants to resist corruption could be employed by ambitious individuals to manipulate and exploit others. The confidence and strategic thinking that helped people overcome genuine obstacles could also be used to justify harmful or unethical behavior. This recognition led Lorenzo to reflect deeply on the relationship between effectiveness and morality in Machiavelli's philosophy. Critics had long accused the Florentine thinker of advocating a moral pragmatism that justified any means necessary to achieve desired ends. Yet Lorenzo's experience suggested a more nuanced interpretation. Machiavelli provided tools for effective action, but the purposes to which those tools were applied remained matters of individual choice and character. The merchants who had used Machiavellian principles to resist corruption and build legitimate businesses had chosen goals that benefited themselves and their communities. Their success demonstrated that ethical behavior and strategic effectiveness were not necessarily in conflict, indeed, that sustainable success often required maintaining trustworthy relationships and contributing value to others. The problem arose when people applied powerful techniques to selfish or destructive purposes without considering broader consequences. This distinction highlighted the importance of developing wisdom and judgment alongside strategic skills. Machiavelli himself had been deeply concerned with the health of political communities and the conditions necessary for their flourishing. His apparent cynicism about human nature was balanced by a genuine desire to create systems that could channel self-interest toward beneficial outcomes. His focus on effectiveness was motivated not by indifference to moral considerations but by recognition that good intentions without adequate power to implement them were worthless. Lorenzo came to understand that true Machiavellian liberation required not just the ability to pursue one's goals effectively, but also the wisdom to choose goals worthy of pursuit. This meant developing clear principles about the kind of life one wanted to live and the kind of community one wanted to help create. It required balancing personal ambition with broader responsibilities and understanding that long-term success often depended on contributing to conditions that benefited others as well. As winter approached, Lorenzo began to see his role shifting from teacher to exemplar. Rather than directly instructing others in Machiavellian principles, he focused on demonstrating through his own actions how strategic thinking could be applied to worthy purposes. He used his growing influence not to accumulate power for its own sake, but to create opportunities for others to develop their own capabilities and achieve their own goals. This approach reflected his deepest understanding of Machiavelli's teachings, that true strength came not from dominating others but from developing the confidence and skills necessary to navigate life's challenges with grace and effectiveness. The goal was not to tear down existing systems out of resentment or frustration, but to evolve them in directions that better served human flourishing and individual potential. The chains that most people wore were forged not by external oppression but by internal limitations, by beliefs about what was possible, by fears about what others might think, by habits of mind that prioritized security over growth and conformity over authenticity. Breaking these chains required not dramatic gestures of rebellion but patient work to develop new ways of thinking and acting that opened up previously unimaginable possibilities. The merchants of Florence who had learned to apply Machiavellian principles had not become ruthless manipulators or power-hungry schemers. Instead, they had become more complete human beings, people capable of pursuing their legitimate interests with skill and confidence while contributing to the broader health of their community. They had learned to rule themselves effectively, which was the foundation for all other forms of leadership and influence. As Lorenzo walked through the same marketplace where his journey had begun, he saw not a collection of resigned individuals accepting predetermined roles, but a community of capable people actively shaping their circumstances and creating new possibilities for themselves and others. The transformation was subtle but profound. It lay not in changed external structures but in changed internal capacities that would continue to generate beneficial outcomes for years to come. The greatest victory was not the departure of a corrupt tax collector or the success of individual businesses, but the emergence of a new culture of competence and self-reliance that would make future exploitation much more difficult and future innovation much more likely. People had learned not just how to solve specific problems but how to think about problems in ways that revealed solutions others could not see. They had developed not just techniques for achieving particular goals but approaches to life that would serve them in whatever circumstances they might face. This, Lorenzo realized, was the true meaning of Machiavellian liberation, not the destruction of all authority or the elimination of all constraints, but the development of individuals capable of thriving within any system while working to improve those systems for everyone's benefit. It was about becoming the kind of person who created opportunities rather than waiting for them, who influenced events rather than simply reacting to them, and who contributed to conditions that enabled others to develop their own capabilities and achieve their own worthy goals. The chains that had once seemed so solid and permanent had dissolved not through force but through understanding, through recognition that they had never been as strong as they appeared and that the power to remove them had always resided within those who chose to develop and exercise it. The path to true freedom lay not in destroying external structures but in transforming internal capacities, not in seeking permission from others but in learning to grant it to oneself, and not in waiting for the world to change but in becoming the kind of person capable of changing it through patient, skillful, and purposeful action. In the end, the most radical act was not rebellion but competence, not destruction but creation, and not the pursuit of power over others but the development of power within oneself. This was the essence of what Machiavelli had understood centuries earlier and what every generation had to rediscover for itself, that human beings were capable of far more than they typically achieved, but only if they were willing to accept responsibility for developing their capabilities and applying them to worthy purposes with wisdom, courage, and persistent effort.